Hello, and welcome back to our lecture on non-experimental research, Chapter 7. In this lecture, I'll be talking about qualitative research. Qualitative research is research that is generally conducted in a natural setting and that seeks to understand complex human behaviors by developing a narrative description of that behavior. Now, qualitative research basically means that we are describing why humans act and think the way they do in a written form. And so this is not number-based like quantitative research is word-based. Now, qualitative research is not inherently a non-experimental method. There are ways to conduct experiments with qualitative research. However, qualitative research does lend itself well to non-experimental methodologies. Qualitative research has a slightly different aim than quantitative research does. So qualitative research, much like quantitative research, tries to understand human problems and human interactions. However, quantitative research typically tries to find the answer to a very specific question, whereas qualitative research tries to develop a holistic portrayal of the problem. That is, they're trying to get a 360-degree view of the problem in order to understand all of the complicating factors that are related to this problem or behavior. Qualitative research forms reports with words rather than statistics. The author's viewpoint forms the basis for the report. That is, their opinions, their perceptions are all critically important to a qualitative research study. Whereas in a quantitative research study, opinions, perspectives generally are not considered in the analysis. Qualitative research also is conducted in a natural setting. It relies on the idea of fieldwork, that is, going out into the community where this problem is occurring and actually doing the research. Whereas quantitative research typically lends itself better to a laboratory setting where we can carefully, precisely measure all the variables of interest and control all those unwanted variables. Now, I said that qualitative research relies on the idea of fieldwork, that is, going out into the field and seeing what sort of problems are occurring and how they are occurring. This idea is called participant observation, whereas we're learning about a culture from the perspective of members of that culture. And this is where the researcher actually becomes part of the group. Now, I have the word culture here within quotations because culture doesn't necessarily mean an ethnic or racial culture in this sense. What I mean by the word culture is it could be gang life culture. This could be the culture of an elite prep school. This could be the culture of a financial firm, right? Culture here is a very loose term here. Now, an example of somebody engaging in participant observation could be if you're wanting to see what it's like to be a victim of domestic violence. One of the things that you might do is you may actually go and become a researcher working in a battered women's shelter. And so what you do there is you actually become part of the culture. You become part of the facilitators, you understand the problems that people come in facing, and you would really get to interact with a lot of women who were in a situation of domestic violence, and you'd be able to see what are their concerns, what do they need, and you would conduct your qualitative research study by interviewing typically the victims of domestic violence. Another qualitative methodology that you could use is the idea of a focus group. And focus groups are where you interview participants about some sort of problem, but you do so typically in a more controlled, structured way. And all of these participants actually meet together at one time to discuss the topic of interest. So for example, if you wanted to conduct a focus group on a new product that a company is developing, perhaps let's say they're developing a new toy for a child. If you wanted to run a focus group to see how kids like this toy, you would gather together probably, a group of, 7 or 8-year-olds, and you'd see how do they play with the toys? What sort of behaviors do they engage in? Are they engaging in imaginative play with the toy? Are they using it to build something else? Are they ignoring that toy and playing with all the other toys, right? You would get a sense of what's happening, and then you would ask those 8-year-olds, well, how did you like the toy? What did you do with the toy? What could be done to improve the toy? And by gathering the feedback from your participants, you'll be able to see, do children like the toy? Did the company do a good job? Are there things that the company still needs to do to improve the toy? That could be an example of using a focus group. Qualitative research comes from a different perspective than quantitative research is. And I hinted at that earlier when I was talking about some of the qualities of qualitative research. I said people's perspectives and opinions become part of the written piece. And that is derived from the idea of grounded theory. Grounded theory comes from the world of sociology, and qualitative methodology shares a lot of the same methodology with sociologists, because typically what sociologists are doing is they're going out and studying real-world behaviors and problems as experienced by groups rather than individuals, like we do in psychology. But the methodology of going out and becoming part of the culture and writing up a narrative about that problem is common to both disciplines. Grounded theory here actually states that part of how you should understand a problem is by going out and immersing yourself in this problem. You shouldn't start with a literature review, because knowing the literature too well can actually hamper the creativity that comes when you're engaging in participant research and you're actually there, part of the group. When they have all these participant observations and they need to encompass them into some sort of narrative or written final report, they do a form of coding here. It's very similar to what we do in data analysis, but it's slightly different in that they are trying to look for common sayings that are said by a participant. Let's say that you want to understand why people who are in big financial companies make decisions that ultimately are illegal. And so one of the things that we know is that sometimes these sort of decisions are perpetrated by many people because people who are under people in a position of power feel like they can't say no, or feel like they can't make an alternative suggestion because of the power differential. So for example, if you wanted to engage in qualitative research in this example, you would actually go get hired by a big financial firm, some sort of research associate with the firm, and you would watch what happens in that culture. You would sit in on meetings, you would look for what sort of behaviors people engage in, depending on if you're a person in power or a person who is not in power. And what you would end up doing is you would have all these conversations and you would code them to look for common patterns in what people are saying and what people's behaviors are indicating they're doing. And then from that data, you derive a theory about what is happening. And that's the key with grounded theory, is that you're deriving the theory here based on the data from the real world. So your theory about how people act in situations where people in power are telling them to do something illegal would be based on what you saw in that firm. It would not be based on the literature here. So in grounded theory, you go as a participant and you go in naively. You look at the data that you have compiled, and then you derive theories from that. So by now, I hope you understand how qualitative research is different than quantitative research. And I hope you understand why it could be a non-experimental methodology that's used in order to understand human behavior.